Hello, I'm Mark, and this is In the Round, On-Armature Bus Tutorial Series, Part 10, The Eyes. There are many different ways to build an eye. Some sculptors favor subtractive methods, others compressive, but today we'll be working mostly additively. I have found that this method, which starts quite simply with 3 careful additions of clay, to be the most effective for beginners. We'll then slowly build up the more subtle, complex, and idiosyncratic structures of the eye in subsequent refining passes. Before we begin, it's important to note that there is an enormous range of eye types. They can vary greatly in shape, angle, depth, openness, superciliary overhang, and the amount of fat around them. They also change dramatically as people age. The most obvious feature that differentiates eye types is the presence or absence of an epicanthic fold, which is when the skin of the upper lid covers the medial angle of the eye, fully or partially obscuring the crease of the upper lid. But despite these variations, all eyes are, in certain important respects, the same, and we will focus our initial building on these important similarities, working towards more specific eyes in subsequent detailing and refining passes. By far the most important thing to keep in mind when sculpting eyes is that an eyeball is spherical, more or less. The most common mistake beginners make is to flatten the eye, defining its shape as a 2-dimensional outline from the front view only. To combat this tendency, it's crucial to keep in mind that the visible portion of the eyeball is only a small section of a sphere that's about 1 inch in diameter, and to frequently check its roundness in the profile, top-down, and bottom-up views. As we work, I'll point out other important details and common mistakes to avoid, but this is the big one. If the eye isn't round, it won't look like an eye, whatever else you get right. As always with symmetrically paired features, work on both eyes at the same time. Don't finish one, then start the other. To begin, we'll first check the underlying surface of the eye socket for symmetry of depth and openness. If these surfaces aren't the same, the eyes won't be either. Note also that we'll be building up to the superciliary arch and down into the cheek, so we'll need some space to work. Even for deep-set eyes with a pronounced brow ridge, you'll want a fair degree of openness. A lot has to go in there around the eye, and it's easy to get overcrowded. Take 2 equal knuckle-sized balls of clay and shape them into pointed oblongs, like little American footballs. Position them in the eye sockets. Check their position from the front view, measuring their elevations and the distances between the medial and lateral angles. From the profile, check their angle in the socket. If they look to be pointed up rather than straight ahead, you may need to reorient them a little, or to better flatten the inner surface of the socket. Check the distance between the crest of the eyeball and the bridge of the nose to determine if the eyes are at the right depth. If the eyes are too deeply or shallowly set, it means either that you're using too much or too little clay for your initial addition, or that the sockets themselves aren't the right depth. Adjust accordingly. Work them in with delicate compression around the edges, retaining and even amplifying their curvature. Be careful not to flatten or facet them. Don't use moisture for this. It will quickly make the clay too mushy to effectively shape. Roll 2 thin, slightly tapered coils of clay. Starting at the medial angle, carefully lay them along the top of the eye to define the shape of the upper lid. Again, with dry hands, gently compress, not straight back into the head, but against the eyeball itself. It's important to remember that the lids sheathe the eyes, conforming to their curvature, so make sure when shaping them that they aren't cutting into the curve of the eye. Establish a sharp transition between the front plane of the lid and its leading edge, which is more flat than round. Make sure that the lids have sufficient thickness. If you make them too thin, it will look like the eyeballs are pressing up against them, trying to escape. At the same time, be careful not to add so much clay that you flood the socket, because we're going to need space to build in the fold of the upper lid. This can be a tricky balance to achieve, and may take a little trial and error. Don't worry if your first or second or even 5th attempt doesn't turn out quite right. Just peel out the lids and try again. The correct balance will become clear with practice. Roll 2 slightly smaller coils of clay, and again, starting at the medial angle, lay them along the undersides of the eyes to define the shapes of the lower lids. As with the upper lids, make sure that they conform to the contour of the eyeball and that they are sufficiently thick. Check the profile view to ensure that the upper lid is further forward than the lower. The angle between the crest of the upper and lower lids should more or less conform to the angle between the superciliary arch above the orbit to the maxilla and zygomatic bones below it. Check also that the lower lid covers enough of the eye. If it's positioned too low, it will look a little like the eyeball is falling out of socket. At this point, the eye probably looks quite schematized, but don't worry, we'll correct that as we proceed. Now that both lids are in place, check the relationship of the medial and lateral angles of the eyes. The lateral angle will typically be a little higher than the medial. Delicately compress to refine the shape of the lids, noting that the opening of the eye is not symmetrical. The curve of the upper lid will tend to be fuller and crest closer to the medial angle, while the curve of the lower lid will be shallower and crest closer to the lateral angle. Again, remember to respect the underlying shape of the eyeball. The division between the lid and the eye should follow the curvature of the eye as it passes under the lid. Avoid cutting into the eyeball. Check that there is sufficient curvature in the lids from the top down and bottom up views. Define the lacrimal lake medially. This little U-shaped bay tends to maintain the curvature of the upper lid more than the lower. Laterally, check that the upper lid slightly overhangs the lower. These three initial additions define the basic eye. Before moving on, double-check the measurements of the medial and lateral angles, elevation, and depth. If anything's off, try to adjust or just scoop everything out and start over. Next, we'll start to build up the structures around the eyes with small, careful additions of clay, specifying them in the process. First, establish the folds of the upper lid with 2 more small coils of clay. Compress them in, again conforming to the curvature of the underlying structures. Just as the eyeball passes under the lid, the bottom section of the lid folds up under the top section. Note that in many eyes, though certainly not all, these folds are articulated in 3 subtle facets. Build up the lateral volume of the lacrimal gland above the folds of the lid and beneath the ridge of the eyebrow. This convexity will transition to a subtle medial concavity at about the midpoint of the eye. Define the slight ridge of the eyebrow, building up the superciliary arch above towards the keystone plane of the glabella and out to the superior temporal line. Using a tiny coil at a very slight volume around the lacrimal lake, then work your way around to build up the volume of the lower lid down to the infrapalpebral sulcus. Throughout this process, use as little water as possible. I've been using dry or only very slightly damp abrasion tools like reticulated foam and stiff bristle brushes, serrated loop tools in a variety of sizes, and compression tools primarily. These are very delicate features, and they will quickly soften to mush if you flood them. If at any point the eyes get too wet to work with, just blow out the excess water and let them stiffen up again before continuing. There are many anatomical and sculptural subtleties to consider when finishing and detailing eyes, some of which are better left until after the removal, hollowing, and reassembly process. The reason for this is twofold. First, this process can be a little rough on fine detail, so you might end up having to redo the eyes anyway. Second, many of the smaller refinements are easier to accomplish after the clay has had some time to stiffen up. For now, you might want to mark out the rough locations of the iris and pupil. This can help you better see if the eyes look right. The iris will generally be a little over 1/2 the total width of the eye opening, and in a relaxed neutral gaze, it will be partially obscured by the upper lid and will just meet the lower lid. In Part 11, Definition, Refinement, and Posing will establish both the direction and focal length of the gaze. At this point, I'll cover the various methods of articulating the iris and pupil, as well as some of the ways you can manipulate light and shadow to imply details that can't be directly captured in clay. For now, double-check your measurements, then let the eyes set up a bit before moving on.